Hello and welcome. My name is Chris from ChristopherHall.com and welcome to episode 29 of the podcast. The topic today is yoga, the history and truth. Now I've added in truth. The reason for that is many people like to think of yoga or the yoga that we know today as an ancient practice. But what we're going to find out is that there are two different types of yoga. And I guess what I would call them is a traditional yoga practice and then modern yoga and its practice. Because the two have not really been separated well enough, certainly in the modern world, because a big part of how they sell yoga to the mass public in the West is the ancient practice and the spiritual connection and this, that and the other. But what we're going to find out as we go through is that there isn't necessarily, it's not that old, and there isn't a great deal of spiritual practice to it. Now that's not to say that yoga isn't a worthwhile practice. It is actually a worthwhile practice. I would suggest that a lot of people take up yoga as a form of physical activity and physical practice to be able to get to know their body, to be able to understand breathing and to be able to understand certain movements. But what we're going to find out is that a lot of that doesn't come from traditional thought, let's say. There are aspects of it, but there's not a great deal of it. So that's what we're going to be exploring as we work through the history of yoga, and we'll be able to bring a better understanding and a bit more of a perspective and informed opinion on what yoga is and how we can go about practicing it, because it has been taken a little bit out of context, certainly in the modern world, as it's grown in the last 10 to 15 years, but certainly in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, as it's sort of taken hold within Western society, if you will. But before I get into all of that, I just want to mention my social media, which is Christopher Hall Training on Facebook and at Christopher Hall on Twitter. So if you're on any of those, please do come along, like and follow. These videos get shared on there. But I try to cover as much as I can with regards to health and fitness. So any topic that I can think of under that umbrella, I'll try and share some information on it. If you've got one, then just stick a comment under this video or come to Facebook, add a comment on my Facebook feed, and I'll be more than happy to create a video based on that topic. So alternatively, you can go to ChristopherHall.com, where again you've got the blog feed, which has got these videos on it. There's a little bit of written text with it and various other links as well that you can get involved in. So again, please do come along there and follow on the website as the blog goes up or as the podcast go up. And it'd be great to have any questions that you may have that I can answer. So coming back to today's topic, which is yoga, the history and truth. So we're going to be starting about 10,000 years ago. So this is kind of a common number when a lot of people tend to say these are the first sort of recordings of when yoga was being taught. And it was being taught by Lord Shiv, or Adi Guru, which is known as the first teacher of yoga. Then quite a long period of time passes, and then as we get to 400 BCE, these things called the Yoga Sutras are written, and they're written by someone called Patanjali, and they're made up of 4 different chapters, which have got a variety of different sutras. There are 196 of them altogether, and they talk about different topics, so the philosophy, the theology, so on and so forth. So across all of those, it talks about sort of yoga and the practice of yoga. But what the Yoga Sutras do is they codify the royal and best yoga practices, presenting them as an 8-limbed system. Now, these things cover the ethical rules of Hinduism, virtuous habits and behaviors, posture, breath, thought and awareness, introspective focus, contemplation and reflection, and then putting it all together as well. So you've got these 8 different components that the Yoga Sutras are sort of built around and promoting. So that was in sort of 400 BCE. So these are, again, the very sort of early stages of yoga. Then again, another sort of 1,000 years pass, and what then happens is Hatha yoga is you could say, invented. So there's 4 chapters, which includes information on asanas, and asanas are basically posture. That's the essence of the word. It means posture. And what we then get off the back of this is where a lot of the different types of yoga that we know today come from. So you've got Kundalini, you've got Iyengar, you've got all these different types of yoga that we know today. They started now to spawn out of, first of all, the Yoga Sutras, then came Hatha Yoga, and now we're starting to get more varieties of yoga. As it then moves on, we start to find and start to understand different asanas that started coming about. So Shiva Samhita then exposes a yoga teaching that calls itself a Tantra, and he describes it as a collection of yoga law. He talks about a complex physiology and names 84 different asanas, 4 in detail. So what we are now starting to focus on, we're starting to focus on postures. They aren't the postures that we know of today. They're less dynamic. So there's a lot of seated postures. There's lying face down. There's lying face up. There's squatted positions. There's arm balances. And then there's standing balance. Now, these types of postures were used as a prerequisite to the seated breathing. So if we're talking about traditional yoga, what we're talking about is being seated, controlling the breath, and controlling thought. That's what, in essence, traditional yoga is all about. When we come into modern yoga, we then start to find the dynamic postures that we know today. But they weren't even introduced until the 1500s, because it's when, in the 1500s, these 84 asanas were introduced, which is the 84 sort of static or more static postures: seated, lying down on your, lying face down, lying face up, squatting, arm balancing, and standing balances. But again, they were used as prerequisites to prepare the body for the seated breathing. So still, again, we haven't yet got to what we know of today as, or what I'm calling, modern yoga. So that sort of takes you through the 1500s up to the 1800s. What we then get in the late sort of 1800s is then we get the yoga coming to the West. Now, this is in 1893, Swami Vivekananda speaks at the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago. In 1902, a German bodybuilder starts measuring Greek statues and takes bodybuilding to India. So what we're now starting to get is the West going over to the East and influencing over there, and then we've got the East coming over to the West and influencing over here. So what we're now starting to find is that East and West are starting to merge and become one thing, if you will. And this is kind of how we have to now start viewing the modern yoga that we know of today. Is it's not necessarily an Eastern practice. They do have Eastern philosophies, or some of the Eastern philosophies, but what we have to understand is that there's been a big influence from the West on our modern yoga that we know today. Because what was starting to happen in the West is a eugenics movement. Now, eugenics movement is basically a movement that started and wanted with the aim of improving the genetics of the human race. So they started using bodybuilding, gymnastics, running, jumping, etc. So they started using that and then teaching it to the mainstream, and they were then obviously taking it on for later years, where the human race would then benefit from those improved genetics, if you will. And this is how yoga started to introduce itself into the West. Is it started taking some of the ideas from certainly gymnastics and building them into their yoga practices. Because what they basically understood is that the people of the West wouldn't take to just sitting, breathing, calming the mind, calming the breath, and focusing on the breath and thought when it comes to like a physical practice. Because the West aren't as or aren't that way inclined like the East is in its tradition, if you will. The West is a little bit more, let's just say, get up and go, and they want a little bit more from it. So at this time, we then start getting the teachers of Iyengar, the teachers of Ashtanga yoga, and you then get all your different Kundalini yoga. So you then start getting schools of yoga, if you will. So this is where it then starts further branching into those schools of yoga. And what these schools of yoga started doing is they started observing the West. So they started reading Swedish gymnastics books. They started observing military physical practices. And what they started doing is they started taking the poses, postures, positions, and the dynamic movements from those, adapting them, and then building them into what they now call yoga, if you will. So what we have to understand is that a lot of the yoga practices that we know today, they're only as old as 85 to 100 years old, or 120 years old, and it's not the ancient practice, because the ancient practice is sitting, breathing, controlling thought, controlling the breath. Then you have the 84 static postures, which were then only used as a prerequisite to yoga. They weren't actually called yoga at the time. They were just a prerequisite to it. And then when it came over to the West in the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, then we started seeing the dynamic posture that we know of today. And it's been said by some, if it's dynamic, it's not yoga. And that's something that may seem a little bit controversial in the modern day, because I know there are a lot of people that are sort of have bought into the ancient traditions of yoga and things like that. But when it comes to what we know as modern yoga, it's not traditional yoga, if that makes sense. And you can look up the origins of the word yoga and the practices that they held, and then you can start to find out more about that. But that could be for a later podcast or episode, but for now it's just trying to get through the sort of the yoga timeline, if you will. What then happened obviously in the 1960s was the Beatles went to India, and this is when it really started to move, because the Beatles were obviously very prominent in the eyes of the public, and a lot of people wanted to follow what they were doing and what they were saying. And this is when we got BKS Iyengar coming to London to teach classes to promote yoga. And then this is where all the yogis and the teachers of yoga now started coming into America, into Europe, into the UK, and started putting on the yoga classes so you could teach it to the mainstream. But what we have to remember is it wasn't sitting and controlling breath for half an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and however long they did it. It was very much for the dynamic movements, the stretching, the dynamic stability of the body, which isn't necessarily the traditional yoga. And I think that's the big sort of how I can summarize it, is what I talked about at the start, is what we have to understand is the difference between traditional yoga and modern yoga. Traditional yoga is, as I've mentioned a few times, it's a more meditative type of yoga. It's controlling breath, it's controlling thought. And then when it comes into the modern time, it's much more about being dynamic, stretching, stability, or dynamic stability, and those different types of things. And what I find as a physical trainer, if you want to call me that, is that because people don't hold the necessary skill level, and what I mean by that is when I ask someone to do a full body movement with a weight, and I'll ask them, whereabouts do you feel that within your body? And they'll say to me, I wasn't paying attention to that, I was just trying to complete the movement. Now what that tells me is they haven't got the mental comprehension of all the different joints working simultaneously. And then only over time, after I sort of teach them to focus on moving this bit and focus on feeling that bit, do they then start to grasp the actual concept. Because what I find with a lot of people when they do yoga, or when I speak to people that do yoga, is I'll ask them those very same types of questions. Not necessarily in the same setting, in a gym environment or exercise or movement environment, but I'll ask them the same questions, and they'll say, no, I'm not really aware of what's happening, I'm just trying to complete the movement. So that shows me that they haven't got the mental capacity and competency to be able to complete those dynamic movements as they are meant to be completed, if that makes sense. And this is a big thing that needs to be brought into, certainly into class yoga, and this is obviously a lot more difficult because they've got so many more people in the room. But it's building that mental capacity and mental competency to be able to complete the movements consciously, rather than just trying to complete the posture or complete the dynamic movement for the sake of completing the dynamic movement. Because if you're completing it for the sake of doing it, it's not having the same effect as, yes, I can feel my hip moving and I can feel this muscle or this area of the body stretching at this time, and then as I bring my rotate my torso and bring my shoulder into it, yes, I can then feel all of that happen, and it pulls on my hip a little bit more. Because what you're then doing is you're developing the mental capacity and the mental map in your brain of how your body is functioning and how it's working, which is the foundation to then how you improve your physical capacity. And this is the bit not only from yoga, but this is a bit from exercise and health and fitness that is missing. It's developing the mental capacity and mental competency to be able to complete things on a much more of a conscious level. What we find in all different methods, this is exercise, any type of exercise, yoga, Pilates, whatever it might be, is they're just completing it because the teacher is telling them to complete it. And they complete it without any real conscious awareness of what's happening within their body and how they're doing it. And that's, I guess, how I can sort of finish this off. And that's where it brings yoga into all of health and fitness, and how we can develop it as a community, if you want to call it that, is stop just trying to complete the movement and really focus on, where's your restriction? Are your shoulders not working? Where's your how well are your hips working? Is it in your knee? Is it in your ankle? Is it rotating your spine? Is that where the limitation is? Or where is the real strength? And then what we can start to do is start to align and put together the body and make it function that much better. So I went off on a slight tangent sort of come the end, but that was me kind of summarizing and bringing what I would describe as the history and the timeline of yoga into the modern day fitness practice. Because at the moment, fitness practice is very much just completing it for completing its sake, rather than actually developing a physical capacity and competency and mental capacity and competency with regards to how well your body is functioning. This is how yoga started out, because they were there controlling thought, controlling breath, which is all about focusing on various different parts of the body, various different thoughts, so on and so forth, which is what's taught in meditation and being in the moment and things like that. All of that's been taught, but it's been taken out of this physical practice element. And it's trying to bring that back in, but that means having to slow physical exercise and physical activity down so the person practicing it can develop that. And that's how we do it. And I'll maybe do it in another one, but how we do that, which I've kind of done already, which is myelination and neuroplasticity. So if you go and listen to my, I think they're whiteboards on building habits and developing habits, there's your extension. That's how you myelinate and develop and neuroplastically remodel the brain to be able to develop a better physical capacity and a better mental capacity to be able to complete it, if that makes sense. So I think I'll leave it there, because I'm really thinking I could go off on another tangent, but hopefully now you understand a little bit more of the history of yoga and where it's come from. We can start to put yoga into a bit more of a perspective and have a little bit more of an informed decision on not only, first of all, do we choose to do it, and then second of all, how we then go and do that practice. And it's being much more conscious of, or having a much more conscious awareness of what our body's doing and developing it that way. So I'll leave it there. Many thanks for listening, and many thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please do come to Facebook, Christopher Hole Training, or Twitter at Christopher Hole, or just go to the YouTube and leave a comment there. It'd be great to answer any of your questions, and it would also be great if you have any other suggestions or you want me to talk about or expand on something that I've talked about today. I can obviously pop that in another video. So many thanks for listening, many thanks for watching. My name is Chris from Christopher Hole Training. I'll speak to you in episode 30.